Exactly. Well, hello again, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this Australian behavioral science meetup, first of the year, I think. Super happy to have you all back again. Appreciate the fact that you're also happy to meet us over your lunch break, at least if you're in the Sydney time zone. As always, we want to give a very quick shout out to our sponsor, who is the Plus UTS Business Futures, which is an enterprise learning arm of the UTS Business School, who is making these meetings possible. So we really, really appreciate that. More about them in the chat. And then normally, as you know of us, we tend to introduce our speakers, tell you absolutely how amazing they are, and this speaker is absolutely no exception. Scott is an absolutely incredible behavioral scientist with decades of experience across a variety of sectors. But now the thing is, and another thing I really appreciate about Scott, except for the fact that we are obsessed with the exact same kind of dog breed, is another thing that I really appreciate about Scott is that he always comes very prepared. So Scott will actually introduce himself and tell you what the talk is about, and we have the privilege of just sitting back and letting Scott, with all his expertise, tell us what's what in the ethical side of behavioral science. So Scott, please take it away, including your own introduction, but we are very, very pleased to have you as a speaker.
Oh, thank you so much. Those very, very kind words. And I know you're all wondering, the breed is Bernese Mountain Dogs. Big, fluffy, wonderful, warm dogs. And I've had one, hope to have several more in the kind of coming years. Greetings from New York City. I can honestly say I wish I was with at least some of you in person, as it's the end of winter here and we've probably had enough of it. But very happy to be with you virtually and to speak about a subject I'm really passionate about, which is the application and hopefully the growth and ethical application of behavioral science in the private sector. As you mentioned, I will give kind of a one-page intro just so you know where I'm coming from. And where that is the consumer and shopper insights world. Most of my career, 20 years plus, was leading an agency that was a global partner to most of the big consumer marketers, the Unilevers and Procter and Gamble's, et cetera. Doing a lot of work around packaging and shopper marketing in particular. And kind of the story I tell is that, the one consistent thing across countries and product categories and everything was always this gap between what people would say, I love this new product, of course I'll buy it, and what they would do, which was usually defaulting to very familiar patterns, walk into the store, grab what they've always bought, etc. So I was always fascinated with this gap. And in fact, a lot of what we did was pioneer much more behavioral tools rather than just asking people questions and hoping that they could tell us what they would do or predict their own behavior. But long story, relatively short, I ended up, as you could see, around 6, 7 years ago, transitioning to a full-time focus on behavioral science consulting with a colleague and really someone I view as a mentor to me named Eric Singler, who is really one of the pioneers of applied behavioral science in France. And if you don't know Eric, I really would recommend you check him out as someone via LinkedIn and elsewhere, just because he's very enthusiastic and always sharing new research and just a lot of enthusiasm and energy. So I did that for several years, focusing primarily on private sector clients, but not necessarily in the consumer goods world. So everything from financial services to healthcare to transport, et cetera. And then moved back to the States. I was living in London. I moved back to the States, as you see, a couple of years ago and joined the Behavioral Insights team based in Brooklyn in the state in New York. But primarily leading engagements with private sector clients for Bid Americas. And I just wrapped that up at the end of the year or at the turn of this year. So it's kind of a brand new horizon for me, but I'm not going to go too much further down that path. I'd rather just jump into what I was going to share. And as I kind of alluded to at the very beginning, really what I'm passionate about and what I'll share some thoughts about, but I'd really love to hear from the rest of you, is this idea of how do we help business leaders in particular, private sector folks, apply behavioral science both ethically and effectively. And I continue to write a good deal about that. And I can certainly point you towards some of the things I've been writing over the past several years that maybe go a little bit deeper than what I can share today. I should mention, by the way, happy to share these slides at the end of the presentation if you'd like them. Also, very happy to answer questions, both in the middle and as we go. So maybe if you type anything into chat, happy, we'll circle back to that in a little while. So with that said, I'll kind of jump in and, maybe give you my 2 cents on kind of where I think we are. Again, primarily with this private sector lens and focus, which is really, again, where I come from and what I have to share. And I think it's undeniable that, the past 10 to 15 years, we've accomplished a great deal as a field, thanks to many wonderful people who've really done a great deal, I think, to both popularize the field and influence, and create a lot of awareness, and at the very least get people to think twice about how they're thinking about human decision making and many related topics. And I do think, when we look at the private sector side, I think it's fair to say that there's been, I use the word inroads in 3 sectors in particular, probably financial services first and foremost, healthcare certainly, and perhaps a third might be insurance. This isn't to say that we don't see behavioral science positions or teams at other organizations, certainly that they exist, but I do think the majority of the energy is focused in these areas. And again, certainly there are several teams we can point to, behavioral science units within large global institutions that are doing terrific work. And again, we can certainly see as the glass half full. But with that said, I do have to say that I think there's an argument to be made that it's half empty as well. We have a lot of sporadic projects, coming from kind of individual champions, a head of sustainability or a risk function or diversity, inclusion, et cetera. But to me, at least, they seem quite sporadic, very driven by individual people, very susceptible to budgets and kind of the ups and downs of business cycles and so forth. And I think kind of this bottom line, that we don't really have a consistent home or source of funding is really where things stand in my mind, certainly with most organizations. And I think that was one of the big adjustments, just talking to my colleagues at Behavioral Insights team, for example. They're very used to seeing RFPs and responding to them and, hopefully winning them. And helping them realize that in the private sector, that's very much the exception to the rule rather than the foundation. And often it's much more about finding these champions, these people who believe in behavioral science, and helping them ultimately to succeed. So, to me, the larger question, and the one that I'm struggling with and thinking about a great deal, is how do we build a foundation for behavioral science that's both ethical, something we obviously feel good about, and sustainable, not in the context of the environment, but sustainable in the sense of growing and dynamic and ultimately having greater impact. And as you can see, if I'm going to try to summarize it, I guess, I think there are 3 areas that I can speak to that I think are somewhat intertwined, that can help us ultimately make further progress, and do it in a way that we feel good about. So the first is this idea of kind of, apologize there, acknowledging the hurdles. And this actually does come from an article that I just put forth just in the beginning of the year, where I talked about, kind of 3 fundamental challenges that I've encountered. And I think I can fairly say that I feel like I hear from other colleagues, whether they're consultancies or individuals within organizations that are trying to make things happen. The first, the idea of lack of definition. The idea that we're kind of can be applied to everything, which arguably can also mean we're nothing or nowhere in particular. And that's an issue that I think we need to really, really focus on. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Second, that behavioral science really, and almost any new idea or any new way of thinking can certainly come across as an implied threat, maybe unintentional, but certainly that can be the message. And that leads to a variety of reactions from passive resistance to, we already do that, etc. And, I don't think we should underestimate that as a hurdle, and something that we need to at least be cognizant of as we're speaking with colleagues, as we're introducing behavioral science to new organizations, new different business leaders. And then lack of budget, you could argue that this is more of an outcome as opposed to a challenge in and of itself. And in fact, I've had some folks say that maybe that third bullet could be some resistance to experimentation, some resistance to data, and some of the process that we bring, the science of behavioral science. But again, at the end of the day, where we end up is a lack of budget to fund either teams or perhaps individual projects. So kind of taking this a little bit further, again, I think the lack of definition, the answer I would give is it's really up to us to define it. And I don't think that means three areas that are universal to everyone or to every organization. Obviously, I've tried my best to kind of be a voice pointing to opportunities that I think make a lot of sense. And in this case, it's not individual projects, but larger areas. And I'll explain in a moment why I would speak to these three. But I think maybe the larger message I'd want to send is that it's really defining use cases or perhaps business functions within within a specific organization where we think behavioral science really can make a sense, and giving it an identity rather than perhaps something that's amorphous and theoretical, but folks aren't linking to their own business challenges. So consumer protection, compliance, or slash, and cybersecurity, kind of 1A, 1B, and people issues. I won't dive into them just in the interests of time, but I will share kind of my thought process behind it. And it's really these 4 points, which is, first and foremost, I'm thinking in terms of not coming to folks with new problems to think about, but focusing on the problems and the challenges that they already are, that are already keeping them up at night. What are they worried about? What are they acknowledging and indeed spending money against? And these are all areas where I would argue organizations are spending significantly. Secondly, and of course there's some judgment here, but I think we can make arguments, pretty persuasive arguments, that these are areas where a lot of energy and again, a lot of investment is being spent, but we aren't necessarily seeing the kinds of outcomes that organizations would like to see. So there's certainly an opportunity to do it better, more effectively, more efficiently. And, thirdly, and importantly, I feel that these are areas with significant intent to action gaps. That's not to say that there aren't people out there that actively want to break the rules, et cetera. But in most cases, when you think of a function like compliance, the majority of people would like to do the right thing, I think, in most cases. And it's a question of helping them rather than persuading them or convincing them. And that's often the question I ask myself when I'm trying to, kind of look a little bit more closely at a situation. Are we basically in the business of persuading and convincing and trying to change minds? Or do we have a situation where people actively want to take better care of themselves, et cetera, whatever the case may be, and we're really helping them make that happen? So again, when I think of, how can we define behavioral science within organizations? Not all three of these may not make sense in a given company, but, can we start to think of areas that check if not all of these boxes? Now, I just to kind of defer for a second, and make the point, when I was at BIT, one of the first things I was thinking about was, where where should we focus our efforts? Because again, if we're trying to do everything or be engaged everywhere, likely we're going to end up without a very clear message. Folks aren't going to know when to call us and reach out. And if that's the case, we're probably going to be in trouble. And here, the criteria, again, this was perhaps on a more organizational level, was just trying to think about these different issues. First and foremost, where do we think we can have social impact? Where do we have areas and situations and problems and challenges where we know behavioral science can make a difference and it's documented? Again, where does it align with our organization's experience, knowledge, case studies, et cetera? And yes, ultimately, do any of those areas intersect with business potential? And as you can see on the right side of the page, these are the areas that we ended up, kind of aligning on, that we felt met these criteria. And health and wellness, probably a pretty obvious one. But both speaking to employee health and wellness, adoption of, healthcare benefits, things of that nature, employee activity, but also potentially applying to end users as well. Sustainability probably doesn't need too much explanation. Digital world was really looking at some of the challenges and issues associated um, with digitization, both from a positive side of how could we help people take advantage of new technology, but also looking at some of the potential harms, whether that's misinformation, bullying and harassment, things of that nature. So again, I think the number one challenge in my mind when we think of private sector is, can we define behavioral science, and I would argue define it in a way that aligns with recognized business challenges. The second one that I spoke to or I alluded to earlier was the idea of kind of an implied challenge, right? That folks can feel threatened, whether we're explicitly stating it or not. Does this come across as essentially a criticism of what they've been doing and threatening in some way? And I think here really starts with the idea of framing. And I realize, over the last year, perhaps more, this lens framing has really probably become more popularized. And it's one I do believe in quite a bit. I think it's a helpful way of thinking about behavioral science and presenting it in a way that's not only true to what we're doing, but also in a manner that folks can view it as incremental and another tool in the toolkit, or an added dimension to what they're doing, perhaps, as opposed to a fundamental challenge to what they're doing. And I do think that's important. And you can kind of see some of the sub bullets, when we're asked what is this new set of what is a new set of lenses all about, a new way of looking at problems and opportunities, et cetera. And you can see some of the sub points that I make. And tied to that, both internally, in speaking with colleagues, and externally, when I'm talking with folks who are basically trying to make the case, and be champions within their organizations, these are some of the points I generally try to encourage them to keep in mind. Again, the point I made before, that, this isn't something new to think about. It's not an extra thing to master and to worry about. It's a way to address the challenges that are already keeping you up at night, as I said. Secondly, this isn't about throwing out everything you've been doing. It's an added dimension, or it's a complement. It's something that we can essentially, use to both make what we're doing more efficient and more effective, or again, perhaps that idea of an extra dimension. And then, of course, the promise and what's exciting to business leaders as well as policymakers, I think, is that, a lot of what behavioral science tells us and teaches us is that sometimes very small changes can indeed have a big impact. And of course, and a continual challenge, is trying to show business leaders who may have read a book or two, or seen a podcast, or grabbed onto one small idea, one heuristic, that indeed it is more than nudging. And to me, that's often about highlighting process, and also highlighting different ways of addressing challenges, emphasizing things like changes in process as opposed to necessarily talking only about interventions. And I mentioned, inevitably, whether you think of it as a hurdle or maybe the outcome of multiple hurdles, ultimately we come down to budget, right? And some of this might be self-evident or perhaps obvious. But I do think the second point is one that's important, and maybe speaks to a larger destination for behavioral science, which is just, and I think when we're in there pitching a behavioral science project, so to speak, um, that almost inevitably becomes a question of, what project is it going to replace, right? It becomes a zero-sum game. If we take 200K out of the budget for this, what's it coming out of? And I think that can, obviously there are opportunities, but I think that can be a self-defeating way of looking at it. And perhaps, it's more about emphasizing that you're already spending, X amount on training efforts, or X amount on compliance efforts, or X amount on employee benefits. We can take this lens, we can take this way of thinking, this way of looking at problems, and help you get a lot more out of that. And, perhaps that is a different way and a way to help them think about this, again, as less of a zero-sum game. So, I know I've spoken a little bit more about, kind of overcoming the hurdles. And I know one, big emphasis, and again, I think these points come hand in hand, is the idea of building an ethical foundation for what we're doing in the private sector, as well as more generally. And I'll just share a few thoughts about that. And I think, to me, one of the first thoughts is the idea that ultimately, I think of this in terms of evaluating individual initiatives or projects rather than evaluating organizations. And I'm not sure that everyone agrees with me on that. I know some of my colleagues at BIT, certainly somewhat thinking differently, thinking about reputational risk, thinking about, should we work with certain organizations? Generally speaking, my answer, again, is to think about the individual initiative and do we feel good about what we're accomplishing, and not putting ourselves in the position of judging organizations. And you can see I point to Meta here as a case, in the sense that, I personally don't agree with every aspect of Meta's business model. And I could say the same thing for almost every organization that we work with, whether it's a healthcare company or a consumer goods company and so forth. But I do feel pretty strongly that the specific initiatives that BIT has been working on with Meta, and they're in the public domain, and you can certainly find them through the BIT blog, which happen to be a lot more about creating deliberative democracy mechanisms for users to help shape the future of some of these policies around disinformation, around bullying and harassment, et cetera, is a very positive thing. And I think we can feel good about. And maybe this is a conversation we can have in a few minutes when I finish speaking here. But I feel like I'm almost always going to default towards, I would rather engage with these organizations and find opportunities to do good, rather than sit back and judge them and essentially not engage. But again, we can talk a little bit more about that later if folks would like to. And certainly there are shades of gray. And this kind of takes me to the next point. If we are evaluating individual projects, how do we do that? What are the criteria that we use? How do we think about it? And, certainly we can get a lot more sophisticated than what I'm sharing here, but I do think this is a good starting point, which is kind of the win-win-win idea. Is it a win for the organization? Now, arguably, that's for the organization to decide, But I would say from my own personal experience, if we don't see clear reason for them to do it, it's unlikely to ultimately get funded. And frankly, I want to do things that organizations feel good about and can point to, because ultimately that's going to create further momentum. Secondly, and I'd argue perhaps the most importantly for, you know, from an ethical standpoint, is it a win for the people that we're impacting, whether those are employees or end users, customers, etc. And certainly there are probably more nuanced conversations to be had about paternalism and are we judging what's good? But I do think the question to ask about, do we see evidence of intent to action gaps? And, are we helping them accomplish things that they want to accomplish? Or are we trying to convince them to do something new and different that they perhaps don't want to do, perhaps for a variety of reasons? Is at least a good question to ask ourselves. And finally, and perhaps again, there's nuance here, but is it a win for society? And again, folks can debate individual points, but I think most would agree, things like improving health and wellness, certainly sustainability, diversity, inclusion, that there are broader societal goals. So, this is something I've written about in a little more detail that I'm speaking now, but I do think it's a good, again, at least a starting point for us to think about individual projects and efforts and start to, quickly identify whether we're doing projects that we feel good about ethically or not. And I would just mention that, a lot of what I try to do and point out are cases that I think embody and illustrate this. I won't go into a ton of detail here, but this is a case, a project that you can see we did back in my time at BVA when I was working with Eric and BVA and Nudge Consulting, that happened to be with a transit company, Southeastern Railway, and they had a variety of delays that were being caused by inadvertent passenger behavior. People panicking when there was an emergency or a health crisis, or people just engaging in unconscious behaviors without thinking very much about it. Boarding the trains, holding the door open for the next person. That happens station after station after station. And it turned into a quantifiable, not only a customer satisfaction issue because trains were getting delayed, but also a clear, specific cost to the organization in terms of fines. So to me, very clear business case, a very clear situation where helping people change their behavior ultimately was a positive for those people. You could argue about the drunken disorder, perhaps, and a positive, overall. So again, it's not always as clear cut as this, I understand, but I would make the point that I think there are cases and situations that, really do meet this win-win-win across any sector. There are some, of course, more specific to financial services, others that might be more specific to healthcare. I think there are a ton of these win-win-wins around employees and employee behaviors, whether it's safer employee behavior, healthier behavior, etc. But again, I think a lot of this, it kind of comes back to the point I was making earlier about defining behavioral science. I think showing these case studies or these situations is a way for us to really help define it, as well as kind of promote an ethical vision for it. But with all that said, I certainly realize that there are a lot of shades of gray out there. And, you can look at this very simple dynamic, and there's going to probably be different percentages, so to speak, in a given case. And cases perhaps where we feel like at the end of the day, it's really being driven by a profit motive. Is that okay? Is that acceptable if it's also doing good? Do we have situations that are kind of win-win, but that third leg might not be there? Is that okay? Are we really nudging for good or intervening for good? Or is it okay to intervene for no harm if we're helping organizations, and or their customers, and or employees. So I don't claim to have answers to all of these, other than I think we can at least start to have frameworks that maybe help us really identify what these issues are. And certainly when we pause in a few minutes, I'd love to hear, some of these cases that you either have encountered or perhaps you are encountering. And again, I'm not going to claim to have the answers, but I think hopefully we can spark a good conversation around them. I'd also make the case that, I've been talking almost exclusively about what areas we focus our efforts, what projects we accept. But I do think that when we talk about building an ethical foundation, that can and should mean more than that. I mean, it can mean building in ethical considerations within the processes by which we go and do the work. And what I'm illustrating is just kind of a mechanism that we used at BVA to help clients ultimately start to prioritize different interventions. So they may brainstorm and come up with, 20 ideas. Can we systematically start thinking about them in terms of opportunity and feasibility? And importantly, when we talk about feasibility, are we talking about ethical considerations? Are we talking about, how comfortable we would feel with this being public, et cetera? And indeed, there are multiple frameworks out there that I think help us go deeper into that. This is one that I'm familiar with. You may be familiar with others from Liam Delaney at London School of Economics. And this, basically talking and focusing on, multiple dimensions of specific nudges or interventions. And again, some of this is more policy oriented, as you can see the reference here, but I think to a large degree, they translate as well to a business or a private sector context. So just to wrap up my comments or my initial thoughts today, I mean, as I'm sure you've heard from the beginning, and this perhaps a function of where I'm coming from in my career, I do acknowledge, of course, that there are trade-offs and some very real considerations around or risks around engaging with private sector organizations. But to me, they are indeed outweighed by just the enormous opportunity for good. Tapping into just the sheer scope and magnitude, the numbers of employees, the numbers of customers impacted. To me, that's an amazing, tantalizing opportunity. And as I pointed to earlier, I would rather engage and help grow the field and help influence it and leverage it rather than walk away from it. Again, that doesn't mean walking away from ethical considerations by any means, but I do think, to me, the scale comes out on the side of engaging. But, I think we have to acknowledge and understand that engaging means, I don't like the word compromising, but I do feel like it means adjusting, and understanding business realities. And, perhaps one of the more visible areas is, when we think about our commitment to testing interventions or testing our ideas. And, of course, there's gold standards, there's academic standards, there's what we might like to do, versus business realities in terms of budgets and timelines. And, I don't know if there's one right way to balance these things, but I do know it's almost always a question of, balancing pragmatism and rigor and finding the right answer for a given situation or a given organization. I'd also say that, when we think about engaging the private sector, there's certain things that we as a larger field, I think, can work towards to, ultimately help create a larger grounding for success. First and foremost, I think really coming together, whether it's as academics or policy focused folk people, and helping those pioneers, the people that are in dedicated behavioral science units or functions or positions and really helping them be successful. And to me, in many cases, that's really helping them become better informed business people. Because in most cases, they're coming together, they're coming into their roles with terrific backgrounds in terms of the behavioral science itself. What I think some of them lack is really a knowledge of the businesses and the business functions and the sufficient grounding to be able to adjust and apply it within this context. And that's where I think we can help each other, by leveraging each other's experiences, bringing people together and so forth. And I help lead a group like this through Bessie, which just, basically the goal is to bring together folks facing similar challenges and helping them connect with each other and hopefully learn from each other. Secondly, I do think that, while I'd love to see more individual companies or organizations really commit to behavioral science and build dedicated teams, I realize that that's most likely going to be limited. And, perhaps the answer for real broad gains in many fields is going to be pulling together public-private partnerships, getting regulators to bring folks to the table, finding alternative funding mechanisms, allowing, organizations to invest jointly in order to, fund large scale efforts to address issues like fraud, for example. And, to make progress on some of the big issues that are often very common, at least to a sector, if not to business as a whole. And thirdly, I'm sure you've read this by now, I feel like we can do a better job of really integrating behavioral science and business education. I think there have been a lot of steps recently, towards master's programs and so forth, which is terrific, in creating the next generation of behavioral scientists. But I think we can and should continue to also focus on making sure that business professionals, whether it's heads of human resources or compliance or insights, are learning this and incorporating it in the way they think and the way they address their roles. And whether that's through master's programs, MBA in business, or it's exec ed programs, or perhaps there are other mechanisms as well. But those are kind of three of the big steps I think we can hopefully work together on to bring the sector forward and really ground it for a successful future. And then just the final slide, and I've kind of rambled longer than I'd hoped as usual. Again, I think, and this probably links to the slide I shared before. I think it's inevitable there's going to be shades of gray, but I think the mentality that public sector good, no moral ambiguity, private sector bad, is just not true. There's shades of gray in all situations, really. And I think we just need to acknowledge that. We also need to acknowledge some loss of control. It's kind of what I was alluding to in terms of adapting to business realities, while maintaining, kind of a core ethical foundation and some guideposts for what we do. And then this last point, which I haven't spoken about as much, when I look ahead and say, what does success look like 10 years from now, 20 years from now? I think it's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that it's bigger, more dedicated behavioral science functions. I think it may ultimately involve integration and more of the way that insights is done, the way that, other functions or processes are done. And I think coming to grips with that may be also critical to us continuing to move forward, again, particularly in a private sector context. So I will leave it there. And hopefully I've left, at least a reasonable amount of time for us to both answer questions, but also maybe to promote a conversation, because I'd really love to hear your thoughts and reactions. So I'll pause for breath. And I don't know, how would you like to go about the chat? Would you like me to just kind of
No,
read the
no, don't worry,
questions.
Scott. Don't worry. Let us at least do a vague job of mediation. First of all, thank you very much for the
Okay, thank you.
presentation. Excellent as always. But I warned you that you have many more slides than 30 minutes. I warned you up front. So you shouldn't be this surprised. But I'm very happy to.
I'm not surprised.
No, you really shouldn't be. I thought with the number of slides, like if you can do that under 30 minutes, you can teach me a crash course on that. But thank you for the absolutely fascinating topic. Helen has already put a question in the chat, which is, can you give an example of what it looks like to incorporate behavioral science into a process rather than just using behavioral science for nudge intervention? So what is really this behavioral scientific lens as applied to a process towards a solution?
Sure. Well, I mean, one that comes immediately to mind that I think may be familiar to some is, just looking at things like how do we approach recruiting, right? And, it's well documented that there are, often subconscious unintended biases that come into play, in kind of classic recruiting and interviewing, et cetera. And there have been, efforts. I know there's everything from software and organizations like Applied, I believe is the one that comes to mind, that are really looking at that process and finding ways to reduce or at least mitigate biases. So I think, that's one example, but I think you can take it much further and start to look at, how do we do um, performance reviews? How do we look at promotion decisions, et cetera, and start to, potentially look at processes. And I've been involved in work, that was looking at gender equality in particular in financial institutions. And, again, how do we look at the process to come up with a less biased process, which will hopefully ultimately results in better outcomes, rather than more traditional, quote, education and training, which sadly and unfortunately has not really been shown to do much.
Sorry, just to check, Helen, does that answer your question? Because I see that your camera has come on. I also see that you're from BVA, so like I feel like you're just an old colleague of Scott's.
Well, actually, we did not overlap. So,
We did not.
But I was really curious to hear this talk. Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. Super exciting to hear your thoughts on the field. And yeah, great response to my question.
Thanks, Helen.
So, Scott, I have a bit of a nasty question for you because those are obviously always my favorite questions. So you mentioned,
anticipating
yeah,
that. Yes.
you know. So realistically, you mentioned, for example, that you've had Meta as a partner. Meta is a good example of a company that runs a lot of behaviorally scientifically informed interventions, which the overall motive sometimes may be questionable for, as it is very unwell. It is pretty clear what Meta wants, and not all of that is very customer or society friendly. Now, you mentioned that there is a real importance in looking at what is an individual piece of work or an individual intervention, rather than just judge the overall company blankly and just as a blanket term, just not interact with it. Have you had experiences with, or are you sometimes wary of the fact that the intervention or the program of work that you're being onboarded for, that you're being asked to support with, is going to be part of something much larger, which initially doesn't look that bad, but maybe one small cog in what turns out to be incredibly bad, or in hindsight, had you known how it would have been used, you would have not agreed to working on. Has that happened?
Ooh. I think my quick answer would be yes. I think that has happened. I think fortunately it's happened more in the process of defining a project and ultimately having the opportunity to not go forward rather than in the middle of a project. And I recognize from experience that it's much harder when you're already engaged and then things start to be, moved in a different direction. This was one, and I'm trying to gauge how much detail I can go, but it's basically around smoking cessation. And, you can envision that at first glance, that's a positive, but ultimately you have to look at the organization's business model and kind of the deeper into conversations we got, the more uncomfortable we got with how some of this might be applied and used. And, I will mention as well that my thought process, and again, it's mine individually, is I would always allow individual employees to opt out of working with individual organizations if they had very strong feelings about that. But I was not comfortable saying we're not going to work with a certain company, a legal company, because we feel that it's, so again, there could be individual opt-outs, but I would feel as long, again, as we're doing something we feel good about, I'm comfortable, I was at least comfortable having the conversation. But to your point, I do think there are times, and maybe even with the best of intentions, that something starts in one direction and can be shifted by engagement of other people down the line, and that's really tricky.
That is very fair. More questions have emerged in the chat from Danielle. I've got the following one. How can we prioritize ethical consideration, for example, with regards to surveillance and AI, when working with the private sector, when profit is very often prioritized over privacy?
Well, again, I wouldn't disagree, and ultimately, I've worked with organizations that I'm not thrilled with their ultimate business model, and there are issues with the meta business model that I'm not thrilled about. I think the question I'd ask is, is the work that I'm doing supporting that business model first and foremost, and basically prioritizing the profit, or am I doing something that I feel, again, is kind of a win-win or win-win-win? And again, I feel like if you start to go down, if you deviate too far from there, I think you can end up raising questions about almost any organization, and that leads us to ultimately limit our ability to engage and hopefully steer them in a positive direction. I may be naive or over optimistic there, but that's kind of my incoming mentality to it. And again, I might not agree with, or agree with is even the wrong term. I might feel that there's a vast amount of things that I just don't want to do with a given company. I'm not particularly interested in helping them sell more, chips or whatever it may be. But I would argue there is almost always still a subsection that I feel is, again, win-win-win, for lack of a better term. I might not want to help them sell chips, but I'm very happy to, help them ensure that their employees are taking advantage of mental health benefits that the company is offering. And, I do compartmentalize that. And maybe, maybe not all folks are willing to do that. And, I understand that, but that would be my take.
No, that is very fair. I think similar, because you've already mentioned that, you have a way yourself of evaluating project to project, whether you are comfortable, and that you allow or have allowed your team to do so as well on an individual basis. Question from Lisa then, are there any recommendations on how you might approach this evaluation or evaluating opportunities with an ethical lens? If there's little known about really the customer sentiment with regards to what the company is trying to achieve. So when in your triple win situation, obviously, I'm sure that, overall there is this idea that this is going to be advantageous to the end user, but probably most of that information is as storyboarded by the company or by the client itself. So how do you approach that specifically? Because it may not be the win-win-win it's sold out to be.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. Although I guess, generally speaking, the premise behind behind what we're doing is we're not removing choice for folks, right? I mean, we may be making certain options easier, but we're not taking away, their ability to continue doing what they're doing. So, one way to look at it, in my mind at least, is, if we're making an initiative, let's say, to get more people to use digital tools rather than, helplines for an organization. Some people don't want to change. They truly don't want to change, and they're not going to change, and we're not going to move, we're not going to change that behavior. And I don't think that's ethically wrong as long as we're still giving them the option, perhaps, of, calling the helpline. But my hope would be, there are others who maybe have hesitations, or maybe have fears, or maybe have micro barriers that they need to overcome, but ultimately would like to change because they know it's going to be easier for them, and save them time and money, etc. And if we can get those, if we can get 10% of those people to change, that's probably a huge win. So again, long-winded way of saying, this isn't about forcing the folks that don't want to move. This is hopefully about asking the question of, is there a reasonable percentage of folks who would like to move, or at least very open to it, knowing that ultimately the tools and the techniques and the approaches we use are probably most likely to move those folks. They're not going to change the people that have hard barriers of affordability, or just don't want, lack of interest and hard beliefs against. So that's the way I tend to view it. Maybe that can be self-serving, and maybe there are cases where I'm just wrong. But that's at least a way of thinking about it.
I think some of these problems may also be because I've recently had a chat with his name escapes me, but he's been working in the insurance industry for a long period of time, and essentially he calls some of these problems Brussels sprout problems, or if they're really quite severe, cabbage problems. Which, I mean, it's not because he loves vegetables, but it's more as in, from everyone's perspective, obviously, if you keep eating your Brussels sprouts, if you keep eating your cabbage, you'll get healthier throughout life. It's clearly much, it's a better idea than consistently eating French fries and Haribo, which is mainly my diet. But realistically, this is beneficial for everyone, right? Like the individual stays healthier. For an insurance company, healthier individuals are actually much more profitable, something that most people don't seem to realize. And as well, a healthier society is good. This is a triple win, but unfortunately very much a Brussels sprout or cabbage problem, because when it comes to shove, you prefer French fries to Brussels sprouts. Like it is as simple as that. And then I sometimes wonder, in line with the question that Lisa just posted, if an insurance company is maybe even in collaboration with an NGO or with the government or with the regulator in the domain of health, trying to run an intervention to get people to eat healthier, but people really don't want to, where does that fall within your triple win spectrum? Because it is better for people. Like this is like, I don't think you find a dietitian who would say no to that, or a nutritionist.
Yes.
But on the average, like, I'm gonna be honest, like I prefer a French fry any day of the week.
Yeah. Well, two quick comments, I guess. One, insurance is always the sector that is most, I don't know if intriguing is the right word, but I feel like there's almost the least level of moral ambiguity, in the sense that there really are an enormous alignment of interests. Because as you say, healthier, safer people is good. Arguably, it's certainly good for the bottom line of insurance companies. And, I think we could agree it's probably good for the people. To your point, again, I would argue that the folks that don't, helping the people that want to eat healthier, I think it is a win. Those who really don't want to change probably aren't going to change. And as long as we're not taking away your French fries, maybe we'll make them a little harder to find. But they're going to be out there. We're not changing financial incentives. We're not denying choice. I don't have a huge ethical problem with that. And again, I'd assume that the subset of people that do want to change are the ones that hopefully we might have an impact on. So that's
right.
I guess, the way I would look at that. But yeah, again, insurance is, I would argue, where the alignment of the business model and a lot of what we would like to do, from a societal standpoint, is really, really well aligned. Whereas I wouldn't say it's the opposite in other sectors. And again, I do believe there's this subset of problems and challenges that really align quite well. But there are larger structural issues. There's no question about it, with profit motive and business models. whether it's eyeballs at Meta or, unhealthy food elsewhere and, things of that nature.
Very fair. We are essentially at time. For everyone in the chat who is very curious about other versions of what ethics or applied ethics could look like, Daniela has very kindly put the link to the Institute for the Future's Ethical Playbook to have some useful guiding principles and questions to how you actually conduct ethical research and ethical implementations. Scott, as we have 1 minute left, what are your closing comments, closing questions?
I just wanted to point. I always like to try to point people towards other resources, as Danielle did. And one that I'm guessing many of you may be familiar with is the Manifesto for Applied Behavioral Science from Michael Halsworth, my former colleague at BIT. Definitely touches on some of these issues. It's not all about ethics, but I think certainly a good point, in terms of further reading. And if you're looking to go in a different direction and more about corporate social responsibility and kind of the future of what organizations can and should be doing, this is a new book from, as you can see, Allison Taylor. She's a professor at NYU, and she's involved with an organization called Ethical Systems, which you may want to look up, that does a lot of work around business and purpose. So I just wanted to point that out as something to check out if you're kind of interested maybe in this broader topic of the role of private sector and where, as you can see the subtitle, how businesses can do the right thing in a turbulent world. So I'll just leave with those thoughts, but also maybe, just reinforce that I'd be really happy to speak with folks on individual, just individual issues, points, things that we obviously didn't have time, whether it's Bernese Mountain Dogs or behavioral science. So you can find me obviously through LinkedIn, but you can certainly just reach out in email as well. What I didn't put on here, but I mentioned earlier also, is the practitioners group at BESI, which was formerly Action Design Network. I know it's tough with you in Australia on time zones, but that's another group that I'm a part of that I'd be happy to have folks join if they're able.
All right, Scott, thank you so much. I'm about to get kicked out of this room, so that really wraps up this conversation quite nicely. Again, as Scott mentioned, guys, do reach out to him if you have any individual questions. If you don't dare to reach out to Scott, reach out to me and I will reach out to Scott for you if that's a chain of actions that you prefer. Scott, thank you so much. Always love to hear your insights. We will be in touch to discuss Bernese Mountain Dogs in more detail. And for everyone else on this call, thank you again for joining our monthly meetup, and make sure that you check the event pages, including the LinkedIn group, for the next one, which will be end of March. Have a fabulous rest of the week, everyone, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Have a great
Thank
social
you.
time.
Thank you.